Hello, everyone. I'm Sarah Zemansky, Extension Educator for Purdue Extension in Perry County, Indiana. I'd like to welcome everybody to our monthly webinar. Today we're going to talk about preparing your sheep and goats for winter. And today we have two speakers. We have Elysia Rodgers, who is an Extension Educator from the northern part of the state. And I'll let her tell you about her experience with sheep and goats in a little bit. We also have Mark Kepler, who is also an extension educator for Purdue Extension. And again, a lot farther north in the northern part of the state as well. And so winters are a little bit harsher up there than they are down here in Perry County. And so I'll let them go ahead and tell you about how to prepare your sheep and goats for winter.
All right, thank you, Sarah. So like Sarah said, I'm Elysia Rodgers, and I'm the Ag and Natural Resource Educator with Purdue Extension up in DeKalb County, which is almost the very northeast county in the state of Indiana. So I've been a part of my husband and I's goat operation. I married into the goats. So we've been married for just over 8 years now. So kind of got started with goats there. And then prior to that, my family has been raising hair sheep up in very south central Michigan since about, gotta remember what my timeline is, since about 2006, so about the last 14 years. So we've made it through several different styles of winter, types of winter since then, and things like that. So Mark, if you want to kind of tell a little bit about your background and small ruminants.
Well, I am Mark Kepler. I was raised on a general livestock farm, so I had goats even when I was a kid on our farm, not to a great extent. I've been extension for 35 years, and in the last 25 years, I've got my own farm. So I've got my own goat herd as well as a beef cattle herd, plus my kids have been through all the livestock projects in 4-H. I think they're out there. So that's my background. Some of my goats are dairy goats, some of them are meat goats.
All right, fantastic. So, all right, so Mark and I are here today to kind of talk to you about kind of preparing our small ruminants for winter. Really, there's not, let me get my presentation going here. Oh, come on. There we go. Okay. So really, there's not really a lot that we need to look at or consider for our small ruminants for winter. That's really a lot different than summer. There's just a few changes that need to be made. So things like looking at our shelter. We'll talk about that today. We'll talk about feed, if there's any changes or what changes need to be made there. We'll talk about kind of general health over the winter months. And then if you're planning on kidding or lambing in the colder months, because there are some definitely different considerations there than in warmer months. So winter shelter. So these are a couple of examples. The goats that you can see under the pine trees there, that was our boar goat herd. And even in the storm that was going on there, they honestly preferred to be under the pine trees than in their shelter on that particular day. So it was a pretty good windbreak for them there. They enjoyed it. And then on the right-hand side there, you can see those are my parents' hair sheep, Katahdin Dorper crosses, and one of the pastures that they have just with a 3-sided shelter, mostly for the mules. But they also have access to the barn that you can see in the background as well. So a couple examples of different types of shelters from my own experience. And the biggest thing with our shelters for our small ruminants for winter is really they do not have to be elaborate. You can have a regular barn. So right now, my husband and I, we've got an old, built in 1901, a bank barn, and that's what we use primarily for the majority of our stock. So they have pens that they can come and go in as they want to, or we can bring them in and keep them in if needed. 3-sided shelters certainly work perfectly fine, and we'll kind of talk about the placement and things with those. And then also just natural windbreaks. So you saw in that photo there on the other slide, the boar goats were just out in the storm, but they had the windbreak from the trees, and they were more than happy to be outside and sheltered away for that day. So these are a few examples from both Mark and I's farm. So just some old culverts, things like that, that we've utilized for shelters. You can see they might not be in the best shape. The two on the left that are stacked on top of each other are from my farm. So you can see one's a little more reinforced than the other one, but also enclosed from the west end. So that works well during the winter, kind of keep some of the breezes out. And then the other one is just a couple of tubes, culverts cut in half. They can kind of come and go in as they want. You can see on the right-hand side there, that was one from Mark's farm. And you can see on the top, mouse here, you can see kind of a little loop on the top. And Mark says that he uses that to kind of hook a chain to, so that way he can move it around the farm without having to hand wrestle it like my husband and I do on ours. So just some basic shelters that work pretty well for just keeping some of the wind and things like that off. This is another shelter from our farm. This is kind of in our buck pen, and it's just a three-sided, pretty heavy-duty wood shelter that we just actually put up on runners this spring. Prior to that, it was sitting on the ground, so you can kind of see some of the wear and tear along the base of this building. But we put it up on runners to help make it easier to move for cleaning and things like that. But just a three-sided shelter. This is where our bucks stay. They've got the pasture that goes with it for pretty much 9 to 10 months out of the year. So right now we're in the midst of breeding season, so they're for the most part in the barn at this point breeding does. But you can see there's plenty of ventilation. You can see some of the cracks coming through, so ventilation there, ventilation from underneath and up top, so good airflow. But again, just a nice basic shelter that can help keep the wind and things like that off. Got the mineral feeder in there up off the ground, so they still get their mineral if they want to. So our basic winter housing needs, basically you need a building, a shelter, things like that, that can face south. So the opening will be on the south side or southeast for warmth and to help block out the cold brought on from most of our northerly winds. That would be true anywhere from Indiana, Ohio, Michigan to across the plains in the northeast. We'll get a lot of our breezes coming kind of from a northerly direction. You want to make sure you build your shelter on a slightly elevated area in your pasture with good drainage, because if your shelter's kind of in a low area or a puddle area, you'll get water in there, you'll get muddy floors, which can lead to chilled livestock and things like that. So you want to make sure it's a little bit mounded. So that buck shelter that I showed you, it's actually one of the lower spots on our farm, but it's right where that shelter's positioned is one of the highest points in that pasture. So for the most part, it typically doesn't get flooded. It may get a little damp here or there, but it's easy enough to, they've got other areas they can get a little higher if they want to. So other spacing and considerations we need when we look at our shelters, whether it's barns, three-sided shelters, things like that. We want to make sure that we have adequate space for all of our animals that are going to be in there. So when we're looking at space, when we're looking at things like grown adults, so our ewes, does, bucks, and rams, you want about 8 square feet per animal for space. For lambs and kids, you'll want about 6 square feet of space. So not really a lot of space when you look at it per animal. And granted, a lot of times during the winter, they'll huddle up together, so they're not going to keep their space. They're not going to keep their social distancing, but just kind of providing them that room if they want to. Also kind of look at and think of deep bedding, or how are you going to bed your animals? And we'll talk about that here in just a moment. And we also need to look at and think of ventilation. So you can see here, this is kind of one of the lean-to areas coming off our main barn at my property. You can see we have basically cattle panel up, cattle wire up as kind of a window ventilation area. And then along the top there, you can see what looks like, well, is an old subway banner off of a highway sign that we just bring down and can tape or screw down to that baseboard there if we get southerly winds or it gets bitterly cold, things like that. So we keep that south drape open just about year round, except for maybe during the coldest weeks of the winter. And then the drapes there on the east side of the barn where you can see through, those will put down, probably about Christmas time frame or so, and leave down for the most part until end of February. So about 3.5, 4 months time frame. But we try to keep ventilation going. There's also some smaller windows throughout the barn that you'll see here in a couple other photos. This photo here. So you can see here, this is talking about bedding and things like that. So straw is what's traditionally used for bedding in many barns, just because it's very absorbent, usually, not always, but fairly cheaper than hay. I mean, sheep and goats still enjoy nibbling on it occasionally, but it's fairly readily available in many places. There's also wood chips or sawdust that can be used, and that may be easy to use for if you have pens, bedding, things like that, where it's a little easier to get in and out. So also very common, but caution against them is if you have wool breeds of sheep or goats, the wood chips or sawdust definitely get embedded in their fleece a lot easier. So if you're selling that wool or the fleece from the sheep or goats for actual product, then you'll need to be considerate of this as well. And then lastly, newspaper. Newspaper is not used all that commonly anymore. It used to be where it was used much more frequently, more commonly. It can be very absorbent, but oftentimes very difficult to handle and things like that. And you'd have to be replacing it very, very often compared to the wood chips or the sawdust or the straw. So you can see here in this picture, these were some of our Bordeaux kind of getting nestled in. Typically our Bordeaux would stay out in the pasture where you saw those culverts until maybe about 3 or 4 weeks before they were due to start kidding. And then we'd bring them in to this pen here or another pen in the barn. You can see there on the east side, there's still the windows that are open, so there's plenty of ventilation. There's a door to the north of them that's open, and then that ventilated area that's farther to the south that's open as well. So even though it's the dead of winter, there's still plenty of air getting through here, which helps reduce the ammonia scents and things like that. Mostly helps to keep things somewhat dry. Occasionally we will get some snow in these windows and things like that, but there's plenty of room in these pens for the does and other animals to move around to get away from the snow and still be dry. So that's kind of it on the shelters. So again, doesn't have to be elaborate, but just making sure that you have good dry bedding throughout the winter, and ventilation are the biggest things to consider on your housing. So looking at our winter feed and water needs. So on water, I'm sure many of us have enjoyed this view many mornings and many evenings, but obviously access to fresh water is essential for our animals. Obviously water is the #1 needed thing for them. So you want to be sure to check your tanks at least twice a day as your temperature drops below freezing. That's what we haven't quite gotten to that point yet here in Northeast Indiana. So this coming week is supposed to be in the mid to low 30s at night, but I still don't anticipate having to chop stock tanks yet until maybe another, hoping 2 or 3 weeks. We'll see. So you want to make sure you check them, make sure you have a space adequate enough, because if it freezes over during the day or at night and your animals can't get to the water, typically when you'll chop it open, there'll be a rush to get to it. So you want to make sure there's adequate space when you chop it open, that they can get in there and get the drink that they need and have space and not have to fight over it. And then you may want to consider a submersible water heater or some sort of insulation around your tank to help keep the water from freezing. So when we look at submersible de-icers, is what you could call them, there's a few that you can look at, or a few different styles. So this is just a couple of styles shown here. So these were recommendations from Premier 1 on what size of tank heater you may need in terms of what size tank you have. So for many of us that have kind of a hobby farm, lesser animals, less than a 70-gallon tank, just a 500 watt heater will do. A 70 to 100-gallon tank, 1,000 watt heater, and 100 to 300-gallon tank, you want about a 1,500 watt heater. And then typically you have about 2 different models. So you'll have the floating model, which you see on the top there with kind of the red and the water or the wire around it. So these typically sit in your tank and kind of float around, kind of free floating. So really good for efficiency wise, just because it's not in one location. It can kind of move about as need be, but kind of average in terms of safety, because occasionally the water can get drained down, so those coils can get a little bit warm. Not the best for plastic tanks for that reason, or the Rubbermaid tanks. So typically, floating one, you'll find more in the metal stock tanks. And then the sinking, or what they call the drain plug model, so it fits right into the drain plug of your water tank. Average for efficiency, just because it's only in one location primarily, but much better for animal safety and plastic tanks just because it's not moving about. It's stationary, it's located in one spot. So the reality of an animal going in and bumping it and things like that isn't going to be as likely. So there's also some other tank regulators that I've seen where they've basically taken a smaller tank and set it inside a larger tank and put like spray foam in it to help insulate. So that can certainly help. But when you look at some of our winter nights, if we get things like, extreme colds, things like that, those don't always work as well. So water temperatures, things to consider is our animals typically prefer warm water over cold during the winter. Same as with us. I mean, I'd prefer to drink something that's a little bit warmer during the winter than something that's ice cold. So if you can keep the water temperatures between the 40s and 50s, that's oftentimes more preferable, because cold water, anything below freezing or near freezing, can result in energy loss, which means that our animals need to consume more feed to make up for this loss. Because as you consume cold water, it takes your body more energy to heat that water up to be usable in your body than if it's already partially warmed. So when we're looking at feed, kind of that general rule of thumb, no matter what it is you're feeding, is, especially when you're looking at grain, is to add about a 1/4 pound of feed for every 10 degrees it drops below what's called the critical temperature. And the critical temperature is generally considered to be 25 degrees Fahrenheit. So what critical temperature is at this point, it's when that animal's body starts to need more energy, more feed, basically, to help it continue to regulate its own internal body temperature. So above 25 degrees, it's not quite as important, but once we get below the steady 25-degree temps, that's when you need to start adding some feed to help them regulate their body temperatures better. Now, if it gets down to 25 at night, a couple nights in a row, that's not quite as important as if we get steady 3, 4, 5 days in a row where it's a daytime temperature of 25 degrees and then gets colder at night. So there's really not any special supplementation that you need to do outside of what you normally feed during the winter. Just adding that little bit of extra feed when it gets below 25. So if we're looking at daytime temperatures of, let's say, 5 degrees outside regularly for several days in a row, that's going to be 20 degrees lower than our critical temperature. So you're going to want to add about a 1/2 pound of feed per animal to their diet to go ahead and help them keep their temperature better regulated, to give them that energy they need. When we're looking at hay requirements or forage requirements, basically digestion in the rumen is what really creates a lot of the heat in the body. So even as your small ruminants are sitting there and kind of chewing their cud, not really looking like they're doing a whole lot, there's still that action going on in the rumen. There's still that action of chewing the cud, the swallowing, the regurgitating it. All of that is continuing to help heat the body. So forages are definitely important for your small ruminants during the winter, whether it's hay that's being put out for them, whether it's in small hay feeders in the barn or rolled out in the lot or in your pastures or in hay feeders, things like that. So keeping your forages healthy is also important for your ruminants. So a lot of us think of our pastures, hayfield health, things like that during the spring, summer, and fall when we can really see it, but we also have to think about it during the winter. So snow cover can provide great protection for our forages. It can help insulate them from frozen temperatures, from the ground heaving and thawing, from getting warmed up in the winter sun, things like that, and can also allow for some winter grazing. So stockpiling and things like that can be a whole other conversation that we can have. But basically stockpiling is preserving of larger or taller forages. So not allowing your animals to eat it during kind of the fall months, just so you have basically standing hay come winter. So that way you can allow your animals out, they can go out and kind of forage for themselves. So that's why allowing those longer grasses out there takes a lot less energy for your animals to locate them in order to eat them than if you were to go ahead and overgraze your pastures and get them down to 2 or 3 inches. It takes a lot longer for those forages to be found by your animals, so they're having to waste more energy finding it. Plus, by overgrazing it during the fall, you're not allowing those forages time to recover and keep those nutrients in their roots in the soil to help them make it through the winter months. So forages, healthy forages are important year round. So there are a lot of different hay feeder types out there. So these are example from both Mark and I's facilities that we've used over the years or have developed, things like that. Obviously, there's different types of, these are primarily round bale feeders that we'll be looking at here, but there's definitely different styles of square bale feeders that you can do inside the barns as well. So this is from Mark's home. So you can see it's kind of like a hog panel that he's done. It looks like a 5-sided almost hog panel, and you can see kind of lower where sections have been cut out. So especially for our animals that are horned, having these areas in there where they can get in and out easily without too much worry of their horns getting stuck is definitely beneficial. This is another example. So this would be kind of where you would come up and come in, set your round bale down in, so it sets down in, and you can see underneath where it has kind of the catch pen to help with some of our hay waste during the winter. So the hay will fall into there and they can still continue to eat it and hopefully not waste quite as much. Saw in the previous photo where it's set directly on the ground. So this is another example. This would be one where I can see you could do both round bales and square bales in it. So square bale wise, you'd set it in there, and the sides, you can see kind of looking at side to side, are movable. So as they finish off hay, they can push those panels in and still have access to that hay in the middle. And you can see there's very little hay waste that's going on with this style of feeder here. So these are a few more. These are from our facility. So this is an example of a hay feeder that my husband developed last year. And so you can see just 4 basic panels that he's utilized, welded a frame around it, things like that. But this is a round bale that we've put in there. These are our dry stock from this year. You can see there is some hay waste going on the ground below it. And we'll see, I think, a better photo here. But you can see kind of spread out a little bit. But this is hay. This feeder has been in this pretty much exact same location since last December. So there might be a couple of inches of hay waste going on kind of in that whole area. But when you consider since last December, we've probably had, let's see, we probably had about 15 or 16 round bales through this feeder so far that I can remember. So not really a lot of hay waste when you consider that. So this style of feeder is very similar to the one that we saw from Mark's place, where the sides, the ends kind of move in as they work on sections of the bale. So it moves with them, so they're still able to access the bale no matter how small it gets. And then the insides just come out, so you can pop one end off or the other, move the round bale in, and reset it. So this is another example of several different types of hay feeders that we have at our place. We call these the fence line feeders. So you can see here, kind of a little bit, the slats are at a slant, so the does can go ahead and put their head through, gain access to the hay. So this particular photo here shows us with a round bale in here. The downside to something like this with a round bale especially is we have to set, I don't have it in there. We have to set so many round bales in there if we were to have access to every slot for every doe. Now we can put the round bale in there and flake hay off to feed the rest of this fence line feeder. But that's kind of one of the drawbacks to something like this. If you were going to feed exclusively round bales, is still having to maneuver and handle the hay. We have something like this similar inside of our barn as well. So we have a hay alley kind of to one side of the pens where we can kind of come and go, typically without too many goats being back there. Some of the kids get back there and stuff during kidding season. But it allows them easier access to their hay without actually stepping on it. The only other issue that we've had with this fence line feeder is we get some of our little bit slimmer dairy does that can kind of wiggle their way through it and get out and kind of get into the hay that way. But in order to have the slats big enough for some of our does' heads to get through, we need to have them just a little bit wider. So those are some of the biggest issues we found with something like this. So just a few warnings about different styles of hay feeders as well. So I know many of us have seen where we've tried to use cattle hay ring or horse hay ring style feeders. It may work if you have kind of a multi-species in together in a pen. So you have your steers and things like that. But you can see here some of the issues that we might have if you just have goats in there. There's a lot of hay waste going on there with this feeder. You can see they can get in, they can trample all over it, can kind of get at different angles, which could cause issues if they get caught, things along those lines. And then this is another one from our property. It's just a little weldy feeder that we have inside our barns, just for a little extra hay here or there. But you can see laying underneath there are actually 3 kids underneath it, which is great. It's a nice warm spot for them, but it's also an easy spot when they get a little bit bigger where they could get stuck and they could eventually suffocate if they aren't found soon enough, things like that. So there's a lot of things to consider. Obviously, with both goats and sheep, babies get in all sorts of different situations that get themselves in trouble. But this is just one warning with a feeder like this, word of caution. So looking at our general winter maintenance. So we're looking at kind of health considerations of our animals during the winter that we may want to take special note of. Obviously, checking their body condition score, along with chances of diseases and parasite status, should be done on a regular basis. Obviously, during the winter, they'll typically have thicker wool or thicker hair that may be fluffed up more. So it's going to be harder for us to tell just by getting a good, just quick glance at them to really take a look at those body condition scores. So it may be a case where you need to actually get in there and actually get your hands on the animal and actually feel what it is that they're looking like. So if they're starting to feel a little bit bony, you may need to up your feed. If you're starting to feel a lot more fat, you may need to back them off a little bit. You can also look at the teeth. Those are also good indicators of animal health. So if you're looking at the teeth and they look just not like the sheep or goat teeth should, if they're extra jagged, if they're worn down in areas, it may mean that they aren't getting their food in as easily and it's not digesting as easily. So there could be some health issues as a result of that. We also need to stay up on our hoof trimming. So I know for me during the winter, being out in the barn, rather be inside where it's warm as much as possible. So our hooves do get a little more neglected during the winter. But typically I try to get a good trimming done on everybody, usually Thanksgiving time frame, and then I'll take a look at them again before they'll start kidding or lambing in usually end of February, March time frame. So try not to put too much stress on them, but if we notice hooves that are getting a little long or they're having hoof issues, we'll go ahead and treat them throughout the winter as needed as well. And then we need to be conscious of our ammonia levels in the barns or sheds. And so that needs to be checked on a regular basis as well. So if you walk in your barn or walk near your shed area and you can just smell ammonia in there, then A, obviously you have an ammonia issue. So your bedding needs to be changed, things like that. And B, you probably don't have the best ventilation going on in there. Having good ventilation will help keep those levels down because it keeps some air moving through there and keeps them from getting ammonia levels kind of concentrated. Another thing we need to look at and consider during the winter is the barber pole worm. So it's the most common internal parasite amongst small ruminants, and usually the barber pole worm will lay its eggs on the ground around lambing and kidding time. So it could be late February, early March timeframe when they start laying these eggs. So obviously when our does and ewes are out lambing and kidding in the barn or out on pasture, you'll have babies laying on the ground, and it's a great place for them to pick up these eggs and henceforth hatch the worms in their bodies. So the biggest thing to watch with barber pole worm is to make sure we're not overusing deworming drugs. We don't want to create a resistance to these dewormers for our animals. So being conscious of that, making sure if you can to use fecal samples to determine if your deworming medication is working, making sure we're alternating the type of deworming medication that we're doing. Also making sure to rotate your pastures, so especially during the warm winter months and during the summer. So rotating those pastures to reduce the worm potential, because barber pole worms only have a certain number of days in their lifespan. And so if we rotate the animals out of those pastures, it helps break up that life cycle of the worm. And then also you need to consider culling members of your flock or herd that are more susceptible to worms. So for us, I know this past fall, late summer, early fall, we just had a bunch of does that all of a sudden just started getting really wormy for us. So we had probably 8 or 9 does that we had to really treat for worms this fall. I mean, out of 60 does, that's not too bad, but that's still a sixth of our population that we had to treat. And there were a couple of does that we actually had to treat a second time just because they did not bounce back. So a few of those does definitely went on the cull truck here a few weeks ago, just because we don't need that high level of maintenance around our facility, with both my husband and I working full-time jobs and trying to maintain a herd of that size. So from here, I will hand it over to Mark and let him talk about mites and mange.
Okay, thank you, Elysia. I should be ready to go with this slide. Okay, so the first slide that comes up here is a place of different kinds of manges. that might be on your animals. I think this is a great slide because it shows you different spots on the animal where different types of manges can be at on there. And for example, in my goats and my herd, come wintertime, that ones that you see on the back legs there, the chorioptic mites, are the ones that I seem to have issues with every year and on certain animals. For example, my bucks seem to have it worse than anything else. And where they'll get it at is on those back legs, and you will see those back legs just absolutely become raw and bloody. Little blood spots can show up on it also. So we're going to talk about these different kind of manges and what you might have on your farm and where they may affect the variety of animals that we're looking at. So, hmm. Lisa, you still have control for some reason. Do I need to take it and put it onto me? I do. There we go. All right. So this is the area that we would take a look at. Not seeing the slides.
I can just move it forward for you.
Why don't you? But I don't. Okay, try it. Bring it up. Let me move it. I don't see slides, Alicia. Do you have? Okay. All right. So we're back at it. I don't know what that is in the middle. So when we talk about mites, um, they can be an issue in the whole entire herd. In other words, if one animal's got it, other animals may also have it. And what normally happens is there's a genetic susceptibility, and this is what I see in my place. Certain animals will have mites worse than other animals and will have that issue, but that doesn't mean those mites aren't all throughout the herd. And I always talk about mites. Mites are such small things. As in fact, mites are around us all the time. They are in your bed. They are everywhere. They're dust. You're even on your face. There's mites all over your face right now, and you don't even know they're there. They're not mites that are causing issues, but they are out there. And so they can be very, very small, and they are a type of spider or a small type of spider. Then it's got 8 different legs. So when we take a look at those different animals that we see in our herd, we can have mites all over the place and not even know they're there. The next line comes into play. Anytime we get into treatment of these things, they have eggs that are laying around, and insecticides do not kill eggs, only kill the live insects that are there, or in this case, the mites that are there. And so normally when we do this, and we have to treat these animals, we do it once, we do it again in about a 10 to 12 days, and we maybe ought to make sure, maybe in a third time, in another 10 to 12 days, we come along with that. So to reduce this potential of having mites into our herd, we want to make sure when we bring animals into our herd, we isolate them, check them out, look for the signs, and I'll bet you pretty well you can't see all the mites that are on those animals. They probably may have mites on those different animals that are there. Okay. So that's the treatment aspect of it we're looking at. What you're normally utilizing for control of mites are the permethrin sprays. The permethrin is a type of what I call the methrins. It's a type of insecticide that is a variety of them in that category, but with permethrin, it will control those individual mites that are on there. And again, when we use the permethrins, we're talking about doing it, waiting 10 to 12 days or so, retreating again, or 14 days, and then possibly doing that again as we go along. So that's the one that works on. The second one that comes along is the mectins, and there are a variety of mectins, and one of those is ivermectin. So ivermectin cannot be used as an oral drench, and we utilize ivermectin also as a product that's poured upon the back of our cattle on my farm, but it's not listed for control of pouring onto those animals. So really, when we take a look at the mectins, we're pretty much utilizing a injection to take care of them. So I'll just give you a little story in my case. So I come along with those mites that are on the back leg that I'll talk about a little bit more here about. And so I gave it injections of the ivermectin. And for a couple of years that worked. And then all of a sudden I started getting animals with that and I give them the shot. And 2 weeks later, I'm waiting 2 weeks later, they're just getting worse and worse looking. So I just give them another shot. And I work 2 weeks later, they're getting even worse and worse looking. And at this point, we had to get into the permethrin type products because in my case, on my place, for those mites that were on those animals, the mectins weren't working. The ivermectin wasn't working. So that's why we go ahead and make sure that our products are working, and we have to do it a couple of times. Okay. So that's the ones we might end up using. So there are different kind of mites. This mite is one that's fairly common in sheep and goats. And you can see it looks like it has little pimples there that on its nose and up on its face and around there, these follicle mites. And in each one of those pimples, there could be up to thousands of mites in there. And so we may also see those down on the udder area too on these different individuals. And so they develop in a lot of cases. At the second picture we look down below, that almost looks to me like that animal has got a case of ringworm, but yeah, it's in the same spots that ringworm would potentially show up. But in this case, it happens to be the mites that are coming in that doing that same thing. So we need to look out for those different follicle mites on our different animals and make sure that we may treat them accordingly. This one, the scabies mites. So I think it's a little time to stop and do a little terminology check because there are two words in the goat and sheep world that kind of get messed around, and they are scabies and scrapies. Scrapies is a disease that we are putting our tags on our goat's ears to monitor that progression of that disease throughout the country. And that is a disease that's in, inside of those animals. Scabies, in this case, are the mites that come from a sarcoptic mange that are out there. These are mites that are burrowing into the animal, and I think of them from the standpoint of a scab. You think, look at that goat in the bottom picture there. It's a scabby looking goat. It's got crusties all over it. And so that's what we're looking at with these scrapies mites that come along. In the winter months, things just get absolutely worse with mites, and you see those crusty areas that are on there. You see it on the face, on the ears, the wrinkling, the thickening that goes on, and we get on down to the hair losses that we're seeing maybe in that top goats that are there. So one of the controls that I didn't mention earlier that would work into play here is sometimes we will treat these animals that have those crusty areas on it with oils, and with those oils like vegetable oil, not petroleum oils. So like with vegetable oils and linseed oil, those mineral oil will come into play, and you can do that and treat those areas and kind of smother those mites that are bored into that animal. And so that's what we're looking at with the sarcoptic mange that we're at in these scabies mites. All right, the next guide is the ear mites. And it's interesting about the ear mites are they can be out there and they can be very common, and they do not burrow into the animal. They're just in there just annoying them is what they're really dealing with. And so they can cause there are annoyances in there. They can get the scaling and the crusting and things going on, but they're not burrowing in as bad to that area. And so we can see this animal here has got a situation where it's scratching. And so anytime you see animals around scratching, you think to yourself, what can be my external parasites that are on those different animals that might be causing that to happen? And the mites are one of those ranges. The other ones might be the sheep keds, which are actually flies without wings that are on an animal, and then they can be in there causing some issues on that animal to get it to itching and rubbing. And then also there might be lice on these animals. And this past year, I had to take a goat into the veterinarian that was less than a week of age, and it had issues, and I hadn't been paying attention. And boy, the vet pointed out fairly quickly it had a good case of lice all over it at a week of age. And so we had to get into treating those animals. So that's that type of mite. This is the one that I find on my bucks. You notice the scrotum in the top picture, perfect. It could be right off of my animal. And on the bottom picture, it's got some loss of hair. I have seen it a whole lot worse than that. And that's the chorioptic mites that come into this animal. And lots of times on my herd, it'll show up on those lower legs. And at the same time, I also get the mites around the ears. I don't know if it's the same species or not, but it can be there and it can cause some problems in there. So that's where I get into that animal, and I started to treat that. So my program this year, going into my birthing, which will start about the first, or start, we'll start birthing animals in middle January. I will bring those does and the buck into the stand, and at that point, I intend to give them a treatment for mange and lice. It's a pour-on that we utilize for that. I will give that animal a shot of micro minerals. I will check those eyes for the potential of worms and see what's going on. I will trim the hooves of that animal, and then I will also give it a shot of CD&T, which Elysia will talk about in a little bit. So that's my steps to going into this season. These are issues I've had in the past, and this year for sure, I'm taking that whole herd approach to making sure I don't have the lice and potentially the mange issue coming into my animals.
All right, great. Thank you, Mark. So as Mark alluded, obviously we have to look at our health and consideration of our animals throughout the year, but we also have to pay close attention to our animals when we get into birthing season. So many of us here in kind of Indiana, Michigan, Ohio, Illinois, places like that, ewes and does typically will start lambing or kidding anywhere from end of December to May, June timeframe. But our winter births are the ones that we really need to pay attention to and take a little extra care of. So when we're looking at our early to mid gestation, so basically those first 15 weeks following fertilization, our main goal for our females is to maintain their body condition and of our mature females, so those that are a couple years old or older, and to help increase the body condition of our young females. So if it's possible, it's best if you can feed them separately, because a lot of times I know, at least in our herd, that our older females definitely tend to be a little more dominant over those young females, and so they may cause them to be pushed out of the feeding area. So we want to make sure that all those females are being fed the best that they can. So you want to try to have them with free, easy access to pasture if possible, especially if we've stockpiled some forages. So you want them to have about 2.5 to 4 pounds of hay per day. Obviously, a little bit larger body size will require a little more hay than a smaller framed animal. So plus you'll need things like not necessarily having extra supplemental feed, but just making sure they're maintaining, getting the same amount of feed as needed, making sure they have their free choice minerals, that fresh, clean water. All those are important for early to mid gestation. So not a lot extra compared to what we would normally run. When we're looking at our late gestation, so basically those last 6 weeks, I know we skipped kind of a few weeks in there, but again, just watching those body condition scores, condition of our animals, if they act like they're starting to lose weight, then starting to up their feed a little bit. But the last 6 weeks are the critical time. This is where 70% of the fetal growth of our kids and our lambs happen. So that's why we kind of jumped ahead to these last 6 weeks. So obviously the proper nutrition of our does and ewes is incredibly important during this time. Not only does it help keep their body condition up, not only does it help with the growth of those babies, but it also helps to prevent some pregnancy toxemia or ketosis, and also milk fever. Other nutritional factors that can come into play if they don't have great nutrition could be birth weights. So lower birth weights, we could have higher mortality rates because those babies just don't have the nutrition in their system as soon as they're born to get up and get going. You could have lower milk yields on your females, so they aren't able to produce what those babies need to get their energy to survive. And also you can have dystocia or birthing difficulties. So I know for us, when we've kitted out, we have a couple of does that just for whatever reason carry a lot of extra weight. They're just a larger bodied doe anyways, but they maintain their weight really well, really easily. So we always kind of have to watch them just because they're so much larger. There's extra fat in there, and that can cause some birthing difficulties. So you want your females to have at least a 3 to 3.5. So be in good body condition, if not a little bit heavier on the 5-point scale. You don't want a 4.5 to a 5 because that's getting overweight and obese and really will cause that dystocia and birthing difficulties. But a 3.5 to 4 is definitely suitable for a doe and a ewe at this point in their gestation. You also want to give your CD and T vaccinations about a month before the projected birth. So if you have an idea of when you put your buck or your ram out with your animals, or if you hand bred them or AI'd them, if you know a month out when that should be, if they've been confirmed pregnant, then you can give them their CD and T shots, and that will carry through their system and be in those kids and lambs when they're born. So when we're looking at our late gestation, because it is so nutrient filled, in general, we need to be feeding about 4 to 5 pounds of hay per female per day, plus about a 1/2 to 1 pound of grain per female per day. Now, if our critical temperature again is below 25, you may need to up that amount a little bit more even, along with obviously offering those free choice minerals and the fresh, clean water as well. So when we're looking at early lactation of our animals, so just after birth has occurred, so those first 6 to 8 weeks, obviously there's a lot of nutrients that are being transferred from the mother to the baby at this time, especially if that ewe or that doe is nursing multiple offspring. The more offspring there are, the more milk she has to produce, the more energy she has to burn to produce that milk, so the more nutrients she needs to maintain a good body weight. So if possible, you could separate your females according to number of offspring. That does not happen at our place, but we just make sure that everybody is getting fed and maintaining their weight that they need. So in general, we're looking at upping our hay a little bit. So anywhere from 4 to 6 pounds of hay per female per day, along with at least a pound of grain per offspring being nursed. So if we're looking at a doe or a ewe that's nursing twins, you'd be looking at closer to 2 pounds of grain per day, along with, again, those free choice minerals and fresh, clean water. So this is an example of why, if you've never had it done, getting your forages, your hay, things like that, tested to make sure that you know what nutrients are in your hay is very important. Mark and I and Sarah as well can probably talk hours over hay testing and why it's important, but I'll just put that little announcement in there, is if you've never had your hay tested, please do so. So that way you know that your animals are getting the nutrients that they need from that forage, or if they're not, you can supplement it with other items. You'll have to excuse me, they're re-roofing our building right now. So one of the other important things to have if you're going to be birthing during the winter months is to have a few extra things on hand, or that are a little more important to have. So things like towels, iodine, the molasses or brown sugar for moms, lube, reviewing your birthing techniques, and space in the barn. So towels are obviously important because it's cold in the winter, and if those babies are coming out and mom needs a little help getting them cleaned off, having those towels right there, or if you can bring them out from a warm house where they're a little bit warmer than normal, will really help get those babies up, get them dried off, get them shook around, get them going. Iodine, obviously, to kind of coat the navel to seal off infection, things like that. A lot of times, if we have does or ewes that have had a little bit harder birth, especially at our place, we'll give them some warm water with either brown sugar or molasses in it. It just kind of helps give them a little kick, a little extra balance, just to get them back to kind of over the shock of that harder birthing process to get them going again. Obviously, lube if you need help going in with an animal. Doesn't have to be kept in a warmer area, but it's a lot more pleasant to put warm lube on your hands than freezing cold. And it's a lot more pleasant for that female as well. Also reviewing your birthing and help techniques. So there are plenty of slides, plenty of options out there to show different presentations of animals, things like that. I know we can't see as easily with a sheep or a goat when they're giving birth as to what might be going on. We have to kind of feel more so than maybe in a bovine or an equine animal, but it helps kind of having an idea going in what things may be as you're feeling around. So kind of reviewing those techniques. And then making sure you have that space in your barn to separate or catch new moms if needed. Because a lot of times, some of these first-time moms or older ewes or older does might not, if there are several of them kidding or lambing at the same time, they may get distracted by what another one's doing and walk off without their babies. So these are different examples of catch pens, things like that. So you can see on the left here, this was an example from my parents' place that they did one of the 2 years that they ended up lambing during kind of winter months. Very temporary pens. You can see fairly thin plywood. They just used little pins that attached it to the wall. They could open and close those doors easily. So as those ewes were giving birth, they could kind of separate them off if they needed to, so they could focus on their babies. But then once those babies were a week to 2 weeks old, they just kind of let them out into kind of the larger area, and they just kind of all grouped together like normal. You can see the top right photo there, a ewe that was apparently being a little more difficult. This is a pen or a gate that has an automatic catch area in it, so you can just put her head through there, help those babies eat, things like that. And then the bottom right, you can see this is an example of a couple of the extra catch pens that we have at our place. These are just old cattle pen or hog panel from hog buildings, things like that, hog slats that my husband welded together to create these 2 extra pens. If we need it for overflow space, or if there's a certain doe that needs to be separated to focus on her babies more, it's just a nice, easy area for us to work with if we need it. So looking at our newborns specifically, what they need as soon as they're born. So things, you obviously need to get them dried quickly, especially if it's really warm or really cold, to help prevent frostbite, especially to those ears and those tails. Obviously, it's important to get that nice warm colostrum into them as quickly as possible, because that colostrum is just really concentrated with those calories and can really help them get up and get going. We also may need some extra bedding during this time frame because there's a lot of amniotic fluid, a lot of other stuff that's coming out of these does and these ewes. So you may need to lay extra bedding down just to help keep things a little bit drier in there. And then my caution on heat lamps is they should be used very carefully and sparingly, and definitely not putting them within reach of any animals. I see daily people questioning on what people do to keep their animals warm during the winter. In all honesty, if your animals have grown up in that area or if they become acclimated to it, they should put enough winter covering, hair, wool, even a little bit of layer of fat. They shouldn't need really any supplemental heat to keep them warm, as long as they have a dry area that's out of the wind. But heat lamps can be used on babies if needed. So these are a couple examples of kind of baby warming areas where heat lamps and things like that can be used. So this is an example from Mark's farm. So you can see there just old barrels that he's cut out kind of that doorway to. And then you can see at the top kind of a little hole with a cord coming through it, and that's where he has his heat lamp coming through. So it's not as easy for these older, larger does to get in and knock those lamps down and things like that, but it creates kind of this nice little housing area where the doe can still check on those babies, but those babies can get in and get in a warm area, or barn cat as well. These are a couple other examples, just using old kind of dog kennels, things like that. You can see these babies are a little bit older. but it just kind of gives them a nice little kind of sheltered, protected area. You can see there's some fresh, it looks like sawdust in there. So it's just kind of a little bit out of the way area where they're a little bit more protected from the wind and things like that. And then this is an example from Premier One on their heat lamp that they're advertising. According to their ad, it's more shatterproof. The lamp or light itself is more recessed. There's plastic around it, so there's less chance of burning, things like that. This is definitely a better product than what was out there 10 years ago, but I still give caution to it because it is still a heat source. Heat creates warmer temperatures, and if somehow that lamp gets knocked down into that straw, there's still a chance of a barn fire. So that's kind of my big caution on heat lamps. If you don't have to use them, I would say not. If babies need warmed up, especially at our house, what we'll do is we'll put them in totes and take them either down to our shop or to our house. We heat with wood heat. So during the winter, our house is anywhere from 76 to 82 degrees. Might be a little excessive, but when you're working outside most of the day, it's kind of nice to come into. So it's a great place for us to take babies in if we need to keep them warm or get them warmed back up. So kind of in summary, thank you for joining us today. And basically the winter care of our small ruminants really does take a little bit of time, but a lot of it is easy to do and take care of now ahead of the winter months. So with that, Mark and I would be happy to answer any questions.
Okay, we have some questions.
Okay.
So, first question. My fence guy that built my shelter has the opening facing east and said that is where it should be. Is east okay?
Yep, certainly. East is certainly fine. That's actually where we have ours as well. So south or east is perfectly fine. Most of our winds predominantly come from the north and the west. So east is certainly fine as well. Just think during the winter months, coming from the south, you might get a little bit more sun during the day that helps come in, but east is perfectly fine.
Okay. Our next question. I heard to use small waterers so that the goats can't get in them and get wet and therefore get hypothermia. Have you found this to be a problem with the larger waterers?
So for me personally, we have out in our pastures, what do we have? We have at least 40 to 50 gallon tanks out in ours year round. And we've not had an issue out in the pastures with our animals getting in them, getting hypothermia, things like that. The biggest issue we've seen is in the barn during kidding or lambing season. If you have the bucket setting down on the ground, that can be an issue because those babies can go stumbling around, or that mama can give birth and drop those babies right in that water bucket. And that's where your biggest issue could be in the barn, at least if you have buckets. Now, if you put them up and hang them in some fashion, that can definitely help reduce a good majority of those issues. But in terms of them getting in the water, getting hypothermia, I haven't had that issue myself.
Yeah, I'll throw into that. I use those old mineral tubs as well as these blue tubs. They're about 17 to 20 gallons, somewhere in that area. And I've never had an issue with that. And also point out that what I use for heating sources on those are the bird bath heaters. They're 250 watts. You can put them in there. They won't melt anything. They can lay right on the bottom of it, and they do a very good job. One thing I caution is I bought one a while back and I got it home and it had a foot cord on it. Well, that don't work. I can't plug it in and stick it underwater. So you just make sure those cords are long enough on those things.
And that's probably one of the biggest issues we have as well, because we use tank heaters in ours as well. We have one tank that's situated right outside of our barn. So luckily we have a plug right there, so we don't need a massive extension cord. But our other two pastures, our buck pasture is located at the very south end of our property. So we have to have an extension cord that goes from my husband's shop through his unheated portion of his shop and then outside to the buck pen to get that one done. And then our dry stock pen, we have to run an extension cord from our house to get that one heated. But it's a little extra electricity and a little extra pain getting those cords out there, but it saves me 20 minutes each chore time chopping ice. So
what you need as a kid in the 4-H electric projects, and you'll find yourself with electrical rung all over the place and do wiring projects.
Okay, next question. Where can I get my hay tested?
So there are a lot of different labs across the U.S. that can do hay testing. So here in Indiana, we have A&L, Great Lakes Labs, in Fort Wayne that does testing. I believe there might be a couple down in Indianapolis. There are a couple in Ohio, and there's one in Wisconsin that I've used as well. But if you just Google NAFA, which is the, no, NFTA, National Forage Testing Association, NFTA, they have a list on there of labs that have been tested and proven that should produce good results on your hay test. And it also shows how you should sample your hay to get the hay test done.
Most of the offices, extension offices in Indiana, have those hay test probes or hay probes. So go to your local extension office and they'll show you how to do it and loan it out to you.
Yep.
So we had two people ask, what type of pour-on does Mark use preventatively before kidding time?
So I like the permethrin, and there's a product out there that is called Ultra Boss, and it's a pour-on. It's a permethrin pour-on that we utilize. I have difficulty understanding that. And that Ultra Boss is a permethrin, and you pour it down their back, and it's going to get mange mites all over the animal. What I really prefer to use is the permethrin in liquid in a spray bottle and spray the animals. And obviously in the middle of winter, you're not going to want to spray water all over the animals. Plus, they don't like it. So in the summertime, if I come up with some kind of an issue, I have no problem at all spraying them, and I think that's a better coverage. But again, once I use that Ultra Boss, I'll probably do it 3 times.
Okay, then we have a question. How often do you deep clean the pen/barn in the winter?
So for me personally, we'll usually do one deep clean before we go into the winter. So we have a lot of farmers around us. We have our own rented hay ground, things like that, because we only have 6 acres on our property. So we'll go ahead and do one good deep clean in the fall, usually early to sometime in November is typically when we'll go ahead and do a deep clean of our barn, getting all those pens scraped down to the ground to kind of start fresh and then building from there. And then usually, unless we have a really high ammonia issue or a lot of excess liquid somewhere in a pen, usually we won't touch them again until end of March, April timeframe, where we can still get out on the fields, get the manure on them, but not worry or interfere with any planting or things like that. So that's typically how we'll do the deep cleans in our barn.
Okay, that's all the questions we have. So if everyone will check their email. Okay, actually here we have another question coming in. I have a dirt floor that I covered with straw. Would putting diatomaceous earth help control mites?
Yeah, that helps. Diatomaceous earth is kind of interesting. It is essentially sharp is what it amounts to, and it can utilize that area down there for mites. So that's good. That's good to have it in there, but you don't get very good animal coverage if you think about it over the whole animal. So it'll help, but it won't solve the whole problem.
After does are bred, will you run your bucks with the doe herd until close to kidding, or do your bucks go back to their own pen? For your information, we will be running does into stockpiled pasture.
So for us personally, we will, because we basically hand breed our does. We'll breed them in, put them with our bucks, and then put them back out after a couple of days. So for us, we typically will have them ultrasounded and checked early December to check if they're bred or not. If they aren't bred, then we'll usually keep one buck up per breed, because right now we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 4 different breeds of dairy goats that we're breeding. So we'll usually keep one buck up of each breed, just kind of do cleanup for the month of December, and then everybody else, all the other bucks will go back out to their buck pen. Unless they're junior bucks, then we'll give them a few more months to grow, because putting my little Oberhausley junior buck out with my 6-year-old La Mancha buck right now, no, it's not going to work for either of them. So we'll get our junior bucks in their own pen and let them grow some more before we put them back out with the 2 300-pound beasts that we have out there right now. But for us, that's kind of how we manage it. I know there are a lot of people that will run their bucks or their rams with their females up until maybe a month before birthing is supposed to occur, just to help kind of reduce chores and just to make sure that things are everybody's covered, just in case somebody slips or has an abortion that they don't mean to. So, but it's whatever your breeding preference is. So for us, we like to kind of have a controlled time frame of when our birthing is supposed to occur. So that's kind of why we manage it that way. We know kind of when those does come into heat, when they were bred, so it'll give us a good idea of 150 days out, in theory, when they should have babies. And then obviously the cleanup crew, we know if we put them in December, December 8th, and run them through December 22nd, we know somewhere in that time frame, if they caught, they should give birth in those couple of weeks in April, May. So that's kind of how we do it, just for our own kind of management and sanity point, instead of going out there and being completely surprised, just occasionally surprised at this point.
So I have 30 does in my herd, and I have 2 bucks, which is really good enough as far as the book goes on how many bucks you should have. So I separate them into 2 groups come breeding time. And what I always find is kind of interesting to me, if you got 2 does in heat, the buck will concentrate on one of them and knock the other into the side. And so I guess I'm glad that I have more buck power than I need, because that animal may not get then bred for another 3 weeks after that. So we keep our bucks in with our does the whole time, right up until January. And then once after we've kidded, at that point, we separate them out. Technically, if you got right down to it, if I was doing a beef herd like that, that's not really the way to do it. But with my goat herd, I can end up having goats born late. And if I do, they seem to sell just as well in that situation as any in barn at the other time. So it doesn't bother me.
Okay, if there are no further questions, everybody check your email this afternoon. I'll send out a follow-up email, and it'll come from WebEx. This will be an email from WebEx. It is going to have a link to a survey so we can see what you learned from today. We'd appreciate it if you'd fill that survey out and get it back to us. So everybody have a wonderful afternoon, and thank you to our guest speakers today, Elysia and Mark. So thank you once again, and have a great day.